Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're starting our YouTube video on helping you play chess better. In today's video, I'd like to discuss the average values of the pieces. And I guess I should start off by saying it's not 1, 3, 3, 5, 9. As we teach beginners, it's a very, very good beginner set of numbers to start with. I call those numbers the Reinfeld numbers in honor of the American writer Fred Reinfeld, who wrote a lot of basic chess books back in the 40s and 50s. In fact, when you would go to a bookstore, back when I was young, almost all the chess books were by Fred Reinfeld. So you see those numbers: 1 for a pawn, 3 for a knight, 3 for a bishop, 5 for a rook, 9 for a queen. And it's necessary to teach something like that to everybody who's starting to play chess, because when they have a chance to trade a piece, they have to know whether or not it makes sense to do that. So for instance, suppose two beginners are playing and white plays e4 and black plays a5 and white plays knight f3 and black plays rook a6, and white has to figure out, gee, do I want to play bishop takes a6? And you say to the beginner, okay, that bishop, he's worth about 3 of those pawn things there. And that rook, he's worth about 5 of those pawn things. So if you play bishop takes a6, you're going to get something worth 5. And if he takes your bishop back, he's going to get something worth 3. 5 minus 3 is 2. And you come out ahead. So that's a good trade. All right, so that gets people started. But a lot of people think these numbers somehow have come down from heaven and they're immutable and can't be changed. But actually, they're not even super accurate. And Larry Kaufman did a really neat thing. He examined, I think it was around 1 million chess games or 2 million chess games 20 years ago, which was about 80 million positions. And using the tools he had with the computer, he was able to backtrack the values of the pieces. And he wrote an article about that called The Evaluation of Material Imbalances. And I'm going to go to that right now so you can see it. Larry gave me permission to put it on my website. So let's go over here to the Evaluation of Material Imbalances. And let me read you his first paragraph. Larry says, every novice soon learns a table of material values, and I put in the word average values because we're talking about the average value of the pieces, not the instantaneous values. Pieces can be worth more or less given the situation on the board, but what we're talking about when I talk about these numbers are the average values that you should use throughout the game. Okay, it's correct to change those values based on the position, but for the sake of our discussion here, we're talking about the average values. He says, every novice soon learns a table of material values for the pieces, the most popular being 1, 3, 3, 5, 9. But with a little bit more experience, he learns this table is not always reliable. We're going to talk about that today. There are 2 reasons for this. One is that an accurate table needs fractions, because it would be quite remarkable if the true values of such different types of pieces were all integer multiples of the pawn. The other reason is that the values of the pieces depend somewhat on what other pieces are on the board, especially pawns. I put in the especially pawns. And Larry goes on and writes this wonderful article, which you can find on my website under articles and blogs, or you can just Google the Evaluation of Material Imbalances. When I was a kid, nobody told me what Larry wrote there, but I came to the same conclusion. I said to myself, all right, what if we could measure the height of everybody in a certain town, like let's say all the adults? We could measure them to like a billionth of an inch. And I told you that 23% of the people were exactly 5.0000 feet tall, and 76% were 6.00000 feet tall, and 1% were 7.00000 feet tall, and nobody was in between. Would you believe me? Well, of course you wouldn't, because people are not, 6.00000 feet tall. They're, 5, 9 and a quarter, give or take a smaller fraction. Well, it's the same thing with average piece values. What's the chances that a knight would be worth exactly 3 pawns on the average, and a bishop would be worth exactly 3 pawns on the average, and a knight and a bishop would be worth exactly the same, and a rook would be worth exactly 5 pawns on the average, and a queen would be worth 9 pawns on the average. As Larry said, it would be remarkable if the true values of such different types of pieces were all integer multiples of the pawn, and that's what I came to the conclusion to also. So when Larry did his measurements, and he came out, of course, with a bunch of fractions, then that was much more likely to be the case. And, I tell this to people that, when you use these numbers, it works for most cases. For instance, let's come up with a position. Let me use my library here and bring out number. Let's see if this is the right one. Nope, wrong one. Hold on a second. Okay, so here's a basic safety puzzle that I give to students. It's black's move. If you want, I'll flip the board so black's on the bottom. It's black's move. What should black play? Okay, well, if we use those values of the pieces, suppose black says rooks are worth more than knights. So rooks are 5, knights are 3. Since he's attacking my rook and my knight, I'm going to save my rook, put on an open file. He'll take the knight, attack my pawn. I'll save the pawn. How much does black lose if he does this? Well, originally black's up 2 pawns, and when he plays rook d8 and white takes the knight, now white's ahead a piece, a bishop, for 2 pawns. So a bishop's worth 3, the pawns are worth 2. That tells you that white's up a pawn if black does that. Again, we're using these point equivalent values, where 1 point, of course, is 1 pawn. And by the way, I never use points unless I'm just talking to someone who likes points. I always use pawns, because if you convert from pawns to points, you're converting from something that exists to something that doesn't exist, which makes it more abstract, which actually makes it harder. So in this case, I don't want to say white's ahead 1 pawn. He's ahead the equivalent of 1 pawn, which, as I said, some people call points, but he's really ahead a bishop for 2 pawns. So if you're asking a good player, what's the material imbalance in this position, the player is going to say, oh, I'm ahead a piece for 2 pawns, a piece meaning a bishop or a knight in that context. Okay. But suppose black instead saves the knight, the bishop takes the rook. Well, the difference is that the king can take back the bishop. And of course, in chess, when we trade a rook for a bishop or a knight, we call that losing the exchange. Or if you get the rook for the bishop or a knight, we call that winning the exchange. And as I've said in other videos, the exchange is exclusively meant for a rook versus bishop or knight. It doesn't mean you win a knight for a pawn, or a queen for a rook, or a queen for a knight, or anything like that where you come out ahead in the trade. It's only in this case where you get a rook for a bishop or a knight. We call that winning the exchange for white, or losing the exchange for black. So here, if we look at the balance after that trade, black has a knight and 2 pawns. That, when I say knight and 2 pawns, meaning he's got 7, white only has 5, so he has 2 extra pawns. He has a knight and 2 pawns for the rook. If we use those Reinfeld numbers we talked about earlier, the knight's worth 3, the pawns are each worth 1, that's 5, the rook's worth 5. So this position is about even. That tells you that it's much better for black to do this than it was to play rook to d8. If he plays rook to d8, if he plays rook to d8 here, then bishop takes, wins 3, if we use the Reinfeld numbers, while if he plays knight c6, bishop takes, king takes, he's only losing 2, 5 minus 3, which means in the final position he should be better off. Well, he is. He's got 5 versus 5, while if he plays rook d8, he's down 3 versus the extra 2. So here black is losing, in the other position black is approximately even. For problems like this, the Reinfeld numbers work very, very well. The problem is when you get to things that are closer than this, like in this case it was 3 against 2. You lose 3 one way. If you give him the knight, you lose 2 if you lose 5 minus 3, if you lose the exchange. And, 3 is a lot more than 2. But what if you had something where the values were very, very close? Let's look at a gioco piano. and do that. So let's create a new board. We'll flip the board back around. Okay, flip. All right, so let's say we have a Joko piano. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5. Let's say white castles and black plays knight f6. And now let's say white thinks he's in a two knights defense, which he's not, and plays the bad move knight to g5. All right, what would you play here for black? And the answer is you should just castle. Okay, so if you castle, now you've got a king and a rook guarding this pawn. Let's say white decides to take the pawn. Knight takes f7, rook takes f7, bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7. If we use the Reinfeld values, it says that that trade was a fair trade. White gave up a bishop and a knight, and he got a rook and a pawn. Let's do that again just to show you. White gets 1, black gets 3, white gets 5, black gets 3. Okay, using those Reinfeld values, it says that this was a fair trade. So when I ask people, is this a trade that you would make for white? A lot of beginners would say yes. In fact, some beginners have actually said, oh, but white's better because now black's king is exposed. So not only did I make a fair trade, but his king is exposed. So I'm doing well. More advanced players look at the board and say, okay, well, yeah, it was kind of a fair trade, but black has 3 pieces out and white doesn't have any. So even though black's king is exposed, black's doing very well. Well, it turns out it's even more than that. Black's not only doing well because he has the 3 pieces out to white's none, but also black's king is actually safer than white's king because a king is only as safe as the opponent's ability to attack it, and with his 3 pieces out, black's a lot closer to attacking white's king than vice versa. But besides that, there's also the material issue, and there's 2 material issues here on top of the Reinfeld values if we use more sophisticated values. And the first issue is that bishops and knights together are worth more than a rook and a pawn. In fact, if we use more sophisticated values, early in the game they could be worth as much as a rook and 2 pawns. So in this case, using the Reinfeld values and getting 6 against 6 gives you an incorrect idea. It gives you the idea that this is a fair trade. This is by no means a fair trade for not only the reason I just said, which is that bishop and a knight is worth more than a rook and a pawn, but it's also an unfair trade because when we get to the end of it, knight takes, rook takes, rook takes, bishop takes, king takes, black has what's called the bishop pair. The bishop pair doesn't mean you have 2 bishops. The bishop pair is short for a longer phrase, which is the advantage of the bishop pair, which actually means you have 2 bishops and the opponent does not. And as Larry says in that article, his measurement of the bishop pair is worth close to half a pawn. So not only is white giving up a bishop and a knight for a rook and a pawn and losing material there, but he also is giving black the bishop pair, which is even further material advantage for black. Plus black has all 3 pieces out. So rather than this being even or even a slight advantage to white because black's king is exposed, let's see what the computer says here. We'll bring out Stockfish 10 and we'll turn it on and we'll say Stockfish 10, what should happen here? If you look at the evaluation below the board, it's changing, but it's hovering around -2 pawns, meaning that black is better. So here the computer says that black is better by about 2 pawns. Well, 2 pawns is a lot. Usually it takes about 1 pawn to have a winning position. If you're up around 2 pawns, that's a clearly winning. That's almost into the easily winning position. So if I now played out this game and I had Stockfish play both sides, black should win every game. All right, so black's advantage is not just those extra 3 pieces are out, which is a big advantage, but he also has a material advantage on top of that. And the 2 things together add up to right now almost 2 pawns, -1.9 at the moment at 32 ply. Well, that's a pretty big difference between it being even here. There's one other thing I'd like to point out. Let me turn Stockfish off. And that is, when you trade off pieces that have moved, and they move multiple times, the tempos that they use to make those moves disappears. So here, the reason black has 3 pieces out and white has basically 1 piece developed, which is his king, is that white has moved his knight, king knight, 3 times, and he moved his king bishop 2 times. Black, on the other hand, moved his king twice by castling and capturing on f7, and that's the only piece that really moved twice. He captured the knight with the rook that's off the board, the castling being considered a king move. So that's what happens when you move pieces multiple times and then they get traded off. It's as if the tempos disappeared. If we look at the board and we say, how many moves have the pieces on the board made for white? Well, the e-pawn has made 1 move, and the king and the rook have castled, and that's the only 2 moves that are left for the pieces on the board. It's as if white only used 2 tempo for those pieces. But black, it looks like he's used 4 tempos to bring out the 2 knights, the bishop, and the pawn on e5, and maybe 1 tempo to get the king up to f7. So it looks like black has used 5 tempos and white's only used 2. That's because white lost all those tempos by playing knight f3, knight g5, knight takes f7, bishop takes f7 check. And when you do that, your tempos just disappear and you end up behind in development, which is why you don't want to, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why you don't want to be moving pieces multiple times, especially to trade them off, because all of a sudden the tempos disappear. Okay, so what have we found so far? We found that the Reinfeld numbers 1, 3, 3, 5, 9 are inadequate. We found that the bishop pair is worth about a half a pawn. We looked at the fact that you're losing tempos when you trade off pieces by moving them multiple times. If the 1, 3, 3, 5, 9 is inadequate, what should those numbers be? Well, when Larry wrote the article, he added about a quarter of a pawn to the knight and the bishop to start with. And he added, I think more than that, about a whole pawn to a queen. So I think in that article, he used something like 1 pawn is 1, of course. A knight and a bishop were 3 1/4. A rook was still 5, and a queen was like 9 3/4, if you read that article. Since then, Larry's done more work on that. He wrote a book called The Kaufman Repertoire in Black and White, and in that article, he boosted things up a little bit. So I think now he's suggesting using something like 1 for a pawn, 3 1/2 for a knight and a bishop, 5 1/4 for a rook, and 10 for a queen. So now if we win the exchange, e4, a5, knight f3, bishop a6, bishop takes, knight takes, we have to make 2 adjustments to the evaluation. Before we said that white was winning the equivalent of 2 pawns, 5 versus 3. But now we should, if we use Larry's latest numbers, 5 1/4 versus 3 1/2, that means white's only winning 1 3/4 pawns here, which sounds like who cares? But also, white's giving up the bishop pair. So that's another half a pawn. So now we have to bring it down from 1 3/4 down to 1 1/4. Well, 1 1/4 is a big difference from 2. It's almost half as much, obviously. So when you're winning 1 1/4, that's a lot less than winning 2. Here, I'm sure the computer's not going to like black's, a5 anyway, and he's going to say that white's up by maybe more than 1 1/4. But in general, if you lose the exchange, but you get the bishop pair, you're down about a 1 1/4, and if you can get an extra pawn for it, you're only down 1/4. So a lot of times we see at Grandmaster games or high-level games, somebody will give up the exchange, a rook for a bishop, to get the bishop pair and an extra pawn. And in that case, they're pretty much even. The Reinfeld numbers would say, oh, you're down 5 versus a bishop and a pawn versus 3 and 1. You're down 1 pawn. But if we use the more sophisticated numbers, if you give up the exchange of rook for a bishop and you get the bishop pair and you get an extra pawn, it's almost even instead. And that would be the more proper way to evaluate the position. So when you get these close trades where someone's not winning a lot, like a whole extra pawn, if they're only winning maybe a fraction of a pawn, then that's when using more accurate numbers will be very, very helpful. Okay, now there's also the issue of how good are the pieces with the other pieces on the board that Larry raised. And here, if I remember correctly, Larry says something like, the average value for a knight and a rook is attained when there's about 5 pawns on the board. However, every extra pawn on the board helps the knight and hurts the rook. The knight can jump over things, so it's relatively more powerful than the other pieces when there's lots of pieces and lots of pawns on the board. And the rook is relatively more powerful when it has open files and open ranks to move on when there's less pawns on the board. So what Larry said was you could use the average value of the knight and the rook when there's 5 pawns on the board, and for every extra pawn you could subtract an eighth of a pawn for a knight, add an extra eighth of a pawn for a knight and subtract an eighth of a pawn for a rook. And for every pawn less than 5 pawns on the board, you can add an extra eighth for a rook and subtract an eighth for a knight. So just for the fun of it, let's do that. At the start of the game, if the rook is worth 5 and a quarter and a knight's worth 3.5, there's 3 extra pawns on the board more than 5. So if we add 3 eighths to a knight's 3.5, that brings it up to 3 7/8 at the start of the game. If we subtract 3 eighths from the rook, then 5 and a quarter minus 3 eighths is 4 7/8. So that says at the start of the game, then a knight is worth about 3 7/8 and a rook is worth about 4 7/8. So a knight is only, with a full board without any pawns traded, a knight is only worth about 1 pawn less than a rook in initial position. Now be careful, because when you're playing chess, you might say, well, at the start of the game, I'm okay doing that, but there's a tendency in the game for the pawns to come off the board. There's no tendency to put pawns on the board. So as the game goes on, the rook's going to be worth more and more. So be careful about using that information incorrectly by saying, oh, I'm going to do that right now because there's 8 pawns on the board. So a knight is worth, according to those Larry adjustment numbers, about 3 and we said 3, well, let's see, 3 eighths, 3 and 5 eighths. Oh, no, sorry, 3 and 7/8, and the rook is 4 and 7/8. Now let's do it with no pawns on the board. Okay, so now we have 5 less pawns, so the rook is 5 and a quarter plus 5 eighths, which brings it up to 5 and 7/8. And the knight is 3.5 minus the 5 eighths, which brings it down to 2 and 7/8. So with no pawns on the board, a rook is worth 5 and 7/8, a knight's worth 2 and 7/8. That says with no pawns on the board, a rook is worth 3 pawns more than a knight, which is very interesting. So if we use the Reinfeld numbers, the rook's always worth 2 pawns more than a knight. If we use Larry's most sophisticated numbers, a rook is worth 1 pawn more than a knight with 8 pawns on the board, and is worth 3 pawns more than a knight with no pawns on the board. And with the average number of pawns on the board at 5, he's saying the average position has about 5 pawns for each side. That's when the knight is worth 3.5 and a rook is worth 5 and a quarter. Do you have to know those numbers to play good chess? Of course not. But if you want to be a good player, if you want to get your rating over 2,000, there's no doubt that using the Reinfeld numbers 1, 3, 3, 5, 9 is going to be inadequate. You're going to make some very bad trades and wonder why you're losing the game. In general, as I said, if you make that trade that we did in the Joko piano, we'll bring it up again. If you go around trading a bishop and a knight for a rook and a pawn, and you think you should be even, you're probably going to lose a lot of games, because it's a pretty big material advantage for black when you do that. I'll leave you with a little bit of a story. Good players all know, of course, that on the average, a bishop and a knight is worth more than a rook and a pawn. So usually if there's a trade for a bishop and a knight for a rook and a pawn, they just would, dismiss it and say, I'm not going to do that. So Michael Tal was giving an interview once, world champion Michael Tal, and he says that each game, sometimes he spends a little bit of time looking for cases where he can advantageously trade a rook and a pawn for a bishop and a knight. And he says he doesn't usually find it because the rook and the pawn is worth less than the bishop and the knight, but he knows that his opponent will almost always give it to him and dismiss it as being bad for Tal if he gives up a rook and a pawn for bishop and a knight, and they're going to let him do it. And therefore, if he can find these rare exception cases where he thinks the rook and the pawn is better than the bishop and the knight, they'll probably let him get away with it, and he can make that trade. So it's kind of almost a humorous comment that he's saying, yes, we all know it's bad to trade a rook and a pawn for a bishop or a knight, but I like to sacrifice things. I like to look for these imbalances, and I'm looking for cases where maybe I can get away with that. Okay, so today we've talked about the Reinfeld values, the famous 1, 3, 3, 5, 9. Oh, we should throw in one other thing as a bonus. The king has a fighting value. The values we've been talking about so far are the pieces' trading value and their fighting value. The trading value and their fighting value is usually the same. And of course, if you have a bad bishop, it's going to be worth less than the average bishop. If you have a bishop that's blocked in by a lot of its own pawns, then it's worth less. If you have a knight trapped in the corner, it's going to be worth less. If you have an outpost knight, it's going to be worth more. These are called instantaneous values. So the piece's instantaneous value is going to be more or less than its average value, but its fighting value and its trading value are going to be about the same. That's not true with a king. The king has no trading value. You can't trade a king for other pieces because it's the whole game. But the king does have a fighting value, and you especially see this in the endgame. And the king's fighting value is about 4.25. So those are two important things to remember. One is that the instantaneous values of the pieces, and that's worth an entire video on itself. Or you could buy a book like Andy Soldis's Rethinking the Chess Pieces. But in every given position, pieces are not worth their average value. They're worth more or less. Not just based on how many pawns are on the board, but where they are and where the other pieces are. For instance, a knight and a queen is usually worth more than a bishop and a queen because they work together better. They don't get in each other's way as much as the bishop and the queen do. These kind of things are very important to know as you get to be a better player. And also, you want to give the king an average value of about 4.25 pawns. So if you get into an endgame where you should be using your king, and you're not, it's almost like you're down. You just lost 4.25 pawns when you don't use your king. Very important information. Okay, that's about as much as we can do for today. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video for my YouTube channel. This is Dan Heisman. If you're interested, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.